In a world where stories fade into dust, there is a place where they are kept alive. Here, in these endless halls, voices from centuries past whisper once more, and forgotten worlds open their doors to you. Welcome to Audible Archives, where every word endures and every tale finds its voice.
Walking head held right, then strangers came with smiles and warm wine, and I woke up with chains on mine. The river wept beneath the decks, names erased with each tight breath. I called for justice, none replied. My soul remained, though hope died. Cotton fields and blistered hands, time runs slow through stolen lands, but I held fast to who I'd been, a father lost but not within. The lash can break the skin I wear, but it won't shake the truth I bear. Each sunrise blurred bitter cries, still I kept freedom in my eyes. And though I'm beaten and sold, my spirit sings of days of old. They took my name but not my song. I was born free and I die belong. 12 years passed in burning light, still I dreamed of northern nights. A letter sent, a whisper born from soil of pain. My hope was sworn. I saw the hills of home again, through gates of fire, through loss and rain. My children's names lit up the sky. I held them close and let tears fly. No justice yet for those still chained. Their silent cries and blood remain, but I will speak, I will recall the truth that breaks the nation's wall. I write these words in steady hand, for those who suffer understand that even the darkest grave, a voice can rise, see, so be safe. I walked through hell and lived to stand, still bound by love, not by a brand. Let history hear what I became, a man, a father, still the same.
You're listening to Audible Archives. I'm Rob, your host today, and your witness to one of the most harrowing stories ever told. After 12 long years, the final chapters begin. Solomon Northup has endured cruelty, betrayal, and the erasure of his identity. But in these last chapters, a spark of hope returns. A stranger listens, a letter is written, and for the first time in over a decade, freedom feels within reach. This is the final part of 12 Years a Slave. The fight is not over, but the end is in sight.
Chapter 17. The year 1850, down to which time I have now arrived, omitting many occurrences uninteresting to the reader, was an unlucky year for my companion Wiley, the husband of Phoebe, whose taciturn and retiring nature has thus far kept him in the background. Notwithstanding, Wiley seldom opened his mouth and revolved in his obscure and unpretending orbit without a grumble. Nevertheless, the warm elements of sociality were strong in the bosom of that silent nigger. In the exuberance of his self-reliance, disregarding the philosophy of Uncle Abram, and setting the counsels of Aunt Phoebe utterly at naught, he had the foolhardiness to essay a nocturnal visit to a neighboring cabin without a pass. So attractive was the society in which he found himself that Wiley took little note of the passing hours, and the light began to break in the east before he was aware. Speeding homeward as fast as he could run, he hoped to reach the quarters before the horn would sound. But, unhappily, he was spied on the way by a company of patrollers. How it is in other dark places of slavery, I do not know, but on Bayou Boeuf there is an organization of patrollers, as they are styled, whose business it is to seize and whip any slave they may find wandering from the plantation. They ride on horseback, headed by a captain, armed, and accompanied by dogs. They have the right, either by law or by general consent, to inflict discretionary chastisement upon a black man caught beyond the boundaries of his master's estate without a pass, and even to shoot him if he attempts to escape. Each company has a certain distance to ride up and down the bayou. They are compensated by the planters, who contribute in proportion to the number of slaves they own. The clatter of their horses' hoofs dashing by can be heard at all hours of the night, and frequently they may be seen driving a slave before them, or leading him by a rope fastened around his neck to his owner's plantation. Wiley fled before one of these companies, thinking he could reach his cabin before they could overtake him. But one of their dogs, a great ravenous hound, griped him by the leg and held him fast. The patrollers whipped him severely and brought him a prisoner to Epps. From him he received another flagellation still more severe, so that the cuts of a lash and the bites of the dog rendered him sore, stiff, and miserable, insomuch he was scarcely able to move. It was impossible in such a state to keep up his row, and consequently there was not an hour in the day but Wiley felt the sting of his master's rawhide on his raw and bleeding back. His sufferings became intolerable, and finally he resolved to run away. Without disclosing his intentions to run away even to his wife Phoebe, he proceeded to make arrangements for carrying his plan into execution. Having cooked his whole week's allowance, he cautiously left the cabin on a Sunday night, after the inmates of the quarters were asleep. When the horn sounded in the morning, Wiley did not make his appearance. Search was made for him in the cabins, in the corn crib, in the cotton house, and in every nook and corner of the premises. Each of us was examined, touching any knowledge we might have that could throw light upon his sudden disappearance or present whereabouts. Epps raved and stormed, and mounting his horse, galloped to neighboring plantations, making inquiries in all directions. The search was fruitless. Nothing whatever was elicited, going to show what had become of the missing man. The dogs were led to the swamp, but were unable to strike his trail. They would circle away through the forest, their noses to the ground, but invariably returned in a short time to the spot from whence they started. Wiley had escaped, and so secretly and cautiously as to elude and baffle all pursuit. Days and even weeks passed away, and nothing could be heard of him. Epps did nothing but curse and swear. It was the only topic of conversation among us when alone. We indulged in a great deal of speculation in regard to him, one suggesting he might have been drowned in some bayou, inasmuch as he was a poor swimmer. Another, that perhaps he might have been devoured by alligators, or stung by the venomous moccasin, whose bite is certain and sudden death. The warm and hearty sympathies of us all, however, were with poor Wiley, wherever he might be. Many an earnest prayer ascended from the lips of Uncle Abram, beseeching safety for the wanderer. In about 3 weeks, when all hope of ever seeing him again was dismissed to our surprise, he one day appeared among us. On leaving the plantation, he informed us it was his intention to make his way back to South Carolina to the old quarters of Master Buford. During the day, he remained secreted, sometimes in the branches of a tree, and at night pressed forward through the swamps. Finally, one morning, just at dawn, he reached the shore of Red River. While standing on the bank, considering how he could cross it, a white man accosted him and demanded a pass. Without one and evidently a runaway, he was taken to Alexandria, the shire town of the parish of Rapides, and confined in prison. It happened several days after that Joseph B. Roberts, uncle of Mistress Epps, was in Alexandria, and going into the jail recognized him. Wiley had worked on his plantation, when Epps resided at Huff Power, paying the jail fee and writing him a pass, underneath which was a note to Epps, requesting him not to whip him on his return. Wiley was sent back to Bayou Boeuf. It was the hope that hung upon this request, and which Roberts assured him would be respected by his master, that sustained him as he approached the house. The request, however, as may be readily supposed, was entirely disregarded. After being kept in suspense 3 days, Wiley was stripped and compelled to endure one of those inhuman floggings to which the poor slave is so often subjected. It was the first and last attempt of Wiley to run away. The long scars upon his back, which he will carry with him to the grave, perpetually remind him of the dangers of such a step. There was not a day throughout the 10 years I belonged to Epps that I did not consult with myself upon the prospect of escape. I laid many plans, which at the time I considered excellent ones, but one after the other they were all abandoned. No man who has never been placed in such a situation can comprehend the 1,000 obstacles thrown in the way of the flying slave. Every white man's hand is raised against him. The patrollers are watching for him. The hounds are ready to follow on his track. And the nature of the country is such as renders it impossible to pass through it with any safety. I thought, however, that the time might come, perhaps, when I should be running through the swamps again. I concluded in that case to be prepared for Epps' dogs, should they pursue me. He possessed several, one of which was a notorious slave hunter, and the most fierce and savage of his breed, while out hunting the coon or the opossum. I never allowed an opportunity to escape, when alone, of whipping them severely. In this manner, I succeeded at length in subduing them completely. They feared me, obeying my voice at once when others had no control over them whatever. Had they followed and overtaken me, I doubt not they would have shrank from attacking me. Notwithstanding the certainty of being captured, the woods and swamps are nevertheless continually filled with runaways. Many of them, when sick or so worn out as to be unable to perform their tasks, escape into the swamps, willing to suffer the punishment inflicted for such offenses, in order to obtain a day or two of rest. While I belonged to Ford, I was unwittingly the means of disclosing the hiding place of 6 or 8 who had taken up their residence in the Great Pine Woods. Adam Tatum frequently sent me from the mills over to the opening after provisions. The whole distance was then a thick pine forest. About 10 o'clock of a beautiful moonlight night, while walking along the Texas road, returning to the mills, carrying a dressed pig in a bag swung over my shoulder, I heard footsteps behind me and, turning round, beheld 2 black men in the dress of slaves approaching at a rapid pace. When within a short distance, one of them raised a club as if intending to strike me. The other snatched at the bag. I managed to dodge them both, and seizing a pine knot, hurled it with such force against the head of one of them that he was prostrated, apparently senseless, to the ground. Just then 2 more made their appearance from one side of the road. Before they could grapple me, however, I succeeded in passing them, and taking to my heels, fled, much affrighted, toward the mills. When Adam was informed of the adventure, he hastened straightway to the Indian village, and arousing Cascala and several of his tribe, started in pursuit of the highwaymen. I accompanied them to the scene of attack, when we discovered a puddle of blood in the road, where the man whom I had smitten with the pine knot had fallen. After searching carefully through the woods a long time, one of Cascala's men discovered a smoke curling up through the branches of several prostrate pines, whose tops had fallen together. The rendezvous was cautiously surrounded, and all of them taken prisoners. They had escaped from a plantation in the vicinity of Lamourie, and had been secreted there 3 weeks. They had no evil design upon me, except to frighten me out of my pig. Having observed me passing towards Ford's just at nightfall, and suspecting the nature of my errand, they had followed me, seen me butcher and dress the porker, and start on my return. They had been pinched for food, and were driven to this extremity by necessity. Adam conveyed them to the parish jail and was liberally rewarded. Not unfrequently, the runaway loses his life in the attempt to escape. Epps' premises were bounded on one side by Carey's, a very extensive sugar plantation. He cultivates annually at least 1,500 acres of cane, manufacturing 22 or 2,300 hogsheads of sugar, and hogshead and a half being the usual yield of an acre. Besides this, he also cultivates 500 or 600 acres of corn and cotton. He owned last year 153 field hands, besides nearly as many children, and yearly hires a drove during the busy season from this side the Mississippi. One of his Negro drivers, a pleasant, intelligent boy, was named Augustus. During the holidays, and occasionally while at work in adjoining fields, I had an opportunity of making his acquaintance, which eventually ripened into a warm and mutual attachment. Summer before last, he was so unfortunate as to incur the displeasure of the overseer, a coarse, heartless brute, who whipped him most cruelly. Augustus ran away, reaching a cane rick on Hawkins' plantation. He secreted himself in the top of it. All Carey's dogs were put upon his track, some 15 of them, and soon scented his footsteps to the hiding place. They surrounded the rick, baying and scratching, but could not reach him. Presently, guided by the clamor of the hounds, the pursuers rode up when the overseer, mounting onto the rick, drew him forth. As he rolled down to the ground, the whole pack plunged upon him, and before they could be beaten off, had gnawed and mutilated his body in the most shocking manner, their teeth having penetrated to the bone in 100 places. He was taken up, tied upon a mule, and carried home. But this was Augustus' last trouble. He lingered until the next day, when death sought the unhappy boy and kindly relieved him from his agony. It was not unusual for slave women, as well as slave men, to endeavor to escape. Nellie, Eldred's girl, with whom I lumbered for a time in the big cane brake, lay concealed in Epps' corn crib 3 days. At night, when his family were asleep, she would steal into the quarters for food and return to the crib again. We concluded it would no longer be safe for us to allow her to remain, and accordingly she retraced her steps to her own cabin. But the most remarkable instance of a successful evasion of dogs and hunters was the following. Among Carey's girls was one by the name of Celeste. She was 19 or 20 and far whiter than her owner or any of his offspring. It required a close inspection to distinguish in her features the slightest trace of African blood. A stranger would never have dreamed that she was the descendant of slaves. I was sitting in my cabin late at night, playing a low air on my violin, when the door opened carefully, and Celeste stood before me. She was pale and haggard. Had an apparition arisen from the earth? I could not have been more startled. "Who are you?" I demanded, after gazing at her a moment. "I'm hungry, give me some bacon," was her reply. My first impression was that she was some deranged young mistress, who, escaping from home, was wandering, she knew not whither, and had been attracted to my cabin by the sound of the violin. The coarse cotton slave dress she wore, however, soon dispelled such a supposition. "What is your name?" I again interrogated. "My name is Celeste," she answered. "I belong to Carey, and have been 2 days among the palmettos. I am sick and can't work, and would rather die in the swamp than be whipped to death by the overseer. Carey's dogs won't follow me. They have tried to set them on. There's a secret between them and Celeste, and they won't mind the devilish orders of the overseer. Give me some meat, I'm starving." I divided my scanty allowance with her, and while partaking of it, she related how she had managed to escape and described the place of her concealment. In the edge of the swamp, not half a mile from Epps' house, was a large space, thousands of acres in extent, thickly covered with palmetto, tall trees whose long arms interlocked each other, formed a canopy above them, so dense as to exclude the beams of the sun. It was like twilight always, even in the middle of the brightest day. In the center of this great space, which nothing but serpents very often explore a somber and solitary spot, Celeste had erected a rude hut of dead branches that had fallen to the ground and covered it with the leaves of the palmetto. This was the abode she had selected. She had no fear of Carrie's dogs, any more than I had of Epps. It is a fact which I have never been able to explain, that there are those whose tracks the hounds will absolutely refuse to follow. Celeste was one of them. For several nights she came to my cabin for food. On one occasion our dogs barked as she approached, which aroused Epps and induced him to reconnoiter the premises. He did not discover her, but after that it was not deemed prudent for her to come to the yard. When all was silent, I carried provisions to a certain spot agreed upon, where she would find them. In this manner Celeste passed the greater part of the summer. She regained her health and became strong and hardy. At all seasons of the year, the howlings of wild animals can be heard at night along the borders of the swamps. Several times they had made her a midnight call, awakening her from slumber with a growl. Terrified by such unpleasant salutations, she finally concluded to abandon her lonely dwelling, and accordingly, returning to her master, was scourged, her neck meanwhile being fastened in the stocks, and sent into the field again. The year before my arrival in the country, there was a concerted movement among a number of slaves on Bayou Boeuf that terminated tragically indeed. It was, I presume, a matter of newspaper notoriety at the time, but all the knowledge I have of it has been derived from a relation of those living at that period in the immediate vicinity of the excitement. It has become a subject of general and unfailing interest in every slave hut on the bayou, and will doubtless go down to succeeding generations as their chief tradition. Lou Cheney, with whom I became acquainted, a shrewd, cunning Negro, more intelligent than the generality of his race, but unscrupulous and full of treachery, conceived the project of organizing a company sufficiently strong to fight their way against all opposition to the neighboring territory of Mexico. A remote spot far within the depths of the swamp back of Hawkins Plantation was selected as the rallying point. Lou flitted from one plantation to another in the dead of night, preaching a crusade to Mexico, and, like Peter the Hermit, creating a furor of excitement wherever he appeared. At length, a large number of runaways were assembled, stolen mules and corn gathered from the fields and bacon filched from smokehouses had been conveyed into the woods. The expedition was about ready to proceed when their hiding place was discovered. Lou Cheney, becoming convinced of the ultimate failure of his project, in order to curry favor with his master and avoid the consequences which he foresaw would follow, deliberately determined to sacrifice all his companions. Departing secretly from the encampment, he proclaimed among the planters the number collected in the swamp, and instead of stating truly the object they had in view, asserted their intention was to emerge from their seclusion the first favorable opportunity and murder every white person along the bayou. Such an announcement, exaggerated as it passed from mouth to mouth, filled the whole country with terror. The fugitives were surrounded and taken prisoners, carried in chains to Alexandria, and hung by the populace. Not only those, but many who were suspected, though entirely innocent, were taken from the field and from a cabin, and without the shadow of process or form of trial, hurried to the scaffold. The planters on Bayou Boeuf finally rebelled against such reckless destruction of property. It was not until a regiment of soldiers had arrived from some fort on the Texan frontier, demolished the gallows, and opened the doors of the Alexandria prison that the indiscriminate slaughter was stayed. Lou Cheney escaped and was even rewarded for his treachery. He is still living, but his name is despised and execrated by all his race throughout the parishes of Rapides and Avoyelles. Such an idea as insurrection, however, is not new among the enslaved population of Bayou Boeuf. More than once I have joined in serious consultation when the subject has been discussed, and there have been times when a word from me would have placed hundreds of my fellow bondsmen in an attitude of defiance. Without arms or ammunition, or even with them, I saw such a step would result in certain defeat, disaster, and death, and always raised my voice against it. During the Mexican War, I well remember the extravagant hopes that were excited. The news of victory filled the great house with rejoicing, but produced only sorrow and disappointment in the cabin. In my opinion, and I have had opportunity to know something of the feeling of which I speak, there are not 50 slaves on the shores of Bayou Barf, but would hail with unmeasured delight the approach of an invading army. They are deceived who flatter themselves that the ignorant and debased slave has no conception of the magnitude of his wrongs. They are deceived who imagine that he arises from his knees, with back lacerated and bleeding, cherishing only a spirit of meekness and forgiveness. A day may come, it will come. If his prayer is heard, a terrible day of vengeance, when the master in his turn will cry in vain for mercy. In chapter 17, we enter a realm of risk and fragile hope. Solomon has endured beatings, humiliation, forced labor, and despair. But now he dares to reach. He dares to write, to ask for help, to believe that the world he was stolen from might still remember him. And for that, he must trust another man, a white man, a stranger named Armsby. Imagine it. You're a slave on a cotton plantation in the deep South. Your life, your name, your body, all property. Every whisper could be overheard. Every letter, a death sentence. And yet, you see a window, a fellow laborer, a white man down on his luck, hired briefly by Epps. He drinks too much. He talks too much, but he can write. So Solomon, with fire and trembling in his gut, makes a choice. He gambles on humanity. This chapter centers on a terrible risk. Solomon offers Armsby his story, trusts him with a letter that could change everything. This is not the naivete of earlier chapters. This is a calculated move, made with the knowledge that if Armsby turns on him, it could mean the whip or worse. But Solomon has waited over a decade, and he cannot wait forever for an enslaved person to send a letter to the North, especially one revealing their illegal enslavement, was revolutionary. Postal networks were surveilled. A literate slave was viewed with suspicion. Any letter discovered could lead to torture. And yet, enslaved men like Solomon took the risk, time and again. Why? Because words, even hidden ones, can be louder than chains. But Armsby proves to be exactly the kind of man Solomon feared he might be. Rather than deliver the letter, he tells Epps. He betrays Solomon's trust, not out of hatred, but out of cowardice and ambition. He hopes to gain Epps's favor. He sells Solomon's secret for the illusion of upward mobility. But Solomon, clever as ever, anticipates the betrayal. He denies the accusation. He plays dumb. He survives, merely. This chapter doesn't end with salvation. It ends with a deep, bitter breath. Solomon is not punished this time, but he's reminded again, trust is currency, and it is expensive. Yet in that bitter soil, a seed remains. He will try again. He must, because now he knows the stakes, and he knows that not all white men are Armsby. Somewhere, there is one who will listen, who will believe. Solomon had spoken little, had learned to be quiet, to endure. But this letter, this act, was a scream in ink. It represents everything the slave system fears: a voice, a mind, a connection to the outside world. And though this attempt failed, it proved one thing. Solomon still remembers who he is, still refuses to disappear, still believes that words have power, even when spoken in chains. In chapter 17, we see Solomon at his most vulnerable and his most courageous. He reaches for freedom with trembling fingers, only to be burned. But fire does not always destroy. Sometimes it tempers. And now Solomon is sharper, quieter, more focused. He will try again. He will find someone. He will return home. And those who betrayed him will one day read his name in the history they helped create. Chapter 18. Wiley suffered severely at the hands of Master Epps, as has been related in the preceding chapter. But in this respect, he fared no worse than his unfortunate companions. Spare the rod, was an idea scouted by our master. He was constitutionally subject to periods of ill humor, and at such times, however little provocation there might be, a certain amount of punishment was inflicted. The circumstances attending the last flogging, but one that I received, will show how trivial a cause was sufficient with him for resorting to the whip. A Mr. O'Neill, residing in the vicinity of the Big Pine Woods, called upon Epps for the purpose of purchasing me. He was a tanner and currier by occupation, transacting an extensive business, and intended to place me at service in some department of his establishment, provided he bought me. Aunt Phoebe, while preparing the dinner table in the great house, overheard their conversation. On returning to the yard at night, the old woman ran to meet me, designing, of course, to overwhelm me with the news. She entered into a minute repetition of all she had heard, and Aunt Phoebe was one whose ears never failed to drink in every word of conversation uttered in her hearing. She enlarged upon the fact that Massa Epps was gewined to sell me to a tanner Ober into Pine Woods, so long and loudly as to attract the attention of the mistress, who, standing unobserved on the piazza at the time, was listening to our conversation. "Well, Aunt Phoebe," said I, "I'm glad of it. I'm tired of scraping cotton and would rather be a tanner. I hope he'll buy me." O'Neill did not effect a purchase, however, the parties differing as to price, and the morning following his arrival, departed homewards. He had been gone but a short time, when Epps made his appearance in the field. Now nothing will more violently enrage a master, especially Epps, than the intimation of one of his servants that he would like to leave him. Mistress Epps had repeated to him my expressions to Aunt Phoebe the evening previous, as I learned from the latter afterwards, the mistress having mentioned to her that she had overheard us. On entering the field, Epps walked directly to me. "So, Platt, you're tired of scraping cotton, are you? You would like to change your master? Eh? You're fond of moving round, traveler, ain't ye? Ah, yes, like to travel for your health, maybe? Feel above cotton scraping, I suppose. So you're going into the tanning business? Good business, devilish fine business. Enterprising nigger. Believe I'll go into that business myself. Down on your knees and strip that rag off your back. I'll try my hand at tanning." I begged earnestly and endeavored to soften him with excuses, but in vain. There was no other alternative. So kneeling down, I presented my bare back for the application of a lash. "How do you like tanning?" he exclaimed, as the rawhide descended upon my flesh. "How do you like tanning?" he repeated at every blow. In this manner he gave me 20 or 30 lashes, incessantly giving utterance to the word tanning, in one form of expression or another. When sufficiently tanned, he allowed me to arise, and with a half-malicious laugh assured me, if I still fancied the business, he would give me further instruction in it whenever I desired. This time, he remarked, he had only given me a short lesson in tanning the next time he would curry me down. Uncle Abram also was frequently treated with great brutality, although he was one of the kindest and most faithful creatures in the world. He was my cabin mate for years. There was a benevolent expression in the old man's face, pleasant to behold. He regarded us with a kind of parental feeling, always counseling us with remarkable gravity and deliberation. Returning from Marshall's plantation one afternoon, whither I had been sent on some errand of the mistress, I found him lying on the cabin floor, his clothes saturated with blood. He informed me that he had been stabbed. While spreading cotton on the scaffold, Epps came home intoxicated from Holmesville. He found fault with everything, giving many orders so directly contrary that it was impossible to execute any of them. Uncle Abram, whose faculties were growing dull, became confused and committed some blunder of no particular consequence. Epps was so enraged thereat that, with drunken recklessness, he flew upon the old man and stabbed him in the back. It was a long, ugly wound, but did not happen to penetrate far enough to result fatally. It was sewed up by the mistress, who censured her husband with extreme severity not only denouncing his inhumanity, but declaring that she expected nothing else than that he would bring the family to poverty, that he would kill all the slaves on the plantation in some of his drunken fits. It was no uncommon thing with him to prostrate Aunt Phoebe with a chair or stick of wood. But the most cruel whipping that ever I was doomed to witness, one I can never recall with any other emotion than that of horror, was inflicted on the unfortunate Patsy. It has been seen that the jealousy and hatred of Mistress Epps made the daily life of her young and agile slave completely miserable. I am happy in the belief that on numerous occasions I was the means of averting punishment from the inoffensive girl. In Epps' absence, the mistress often ordered me to whip her without the remotest provocation. I would refuse, saying that I feared my master's displeasure, and several times ventured to remonstrate with her against the treatment Patsy received. I endeavored to impress her with the truth that the latter was not responsible for the acts of which she complained, but that she, being a slave and subject entirely to her master's will, he alone was answerable. At length the green-eyed monster crept into the soul of Epps also, and then it was that he joined with his wrathful wife in an infernal jubilee over the girl's miseries. On a Sabbath day, in hoeing time not long ago, we were on the bayou bank washing our clothes, as was our usual custom. Presently Patsy was missing. Epps called aloud, but there was no answer. No one had observed her leaving the yard, and it was a wonder with us whither she had gone. In the course of a couple of hours, she was seen approaching from the direction of Shaw's. This man, as has been intimated, was a notorious profligate, and withal not on the most friendly terms with Epps. Harriet, his black wife, knowing Patsy's troubles, was kind to her, in consequence of which the latter was in the habit of going over to see her every opportunity. Her visits were prompted by friendship merely, but the suspicion gradually entered the brain of Epps that another and a baser passion led her thither, that it was not Harriet she desired to meet, but rather the unblushing libertine, his neighbor. Patsy found her master in a fearful rage on her return. His violence so alarmed her that at first she attempted to evade direct answers to his questions, which only served to increase his suspicions. She finally, however, drew herself up proudly, and in a spirit of indignation boldly denied his charges. "Missus don't give me soap to wash with, as she does the rest," said Patsy. "And you know why? I went over to Harriet's to get a piece." And saying this, she drew it forth from a pocket in her dress and exhibited it to him. "That's what I went to Shaw's for, Massa Epps," continued she. "The Lord knows that was all." "You lie, you black wench," shouted Epps. "I don't lie, Massa. If you kill me, I'll stick to that." "Oh, I'll fetch you down. I'll learn you to go to Shaw's. I'll take the starch out of ye," he muttered fiercely through his shut teeth. Then turning to me, he ordered 4 stakes to be driven into the ground, pointing with the toe of his boot to the places where he wanted them. When the stakes were driven down, he ordered her to be stripped of every article of dress. Ropes were then brought, and the naked girl was laid upon her face, her wrists and feet each tied firmly to a stake. Stepping to the piazza, he took down a heavy whip and, placing it in my hands, commanded me to lash her. Unpleasant as it was, I was compelled to obey him. Nowhere that day, on the face of the whole earth, I venture to say, was there such a demoniac exhibition witnessed as then ensued. Mistress Epps stood on the piazza among her children, gazing on the scene with an air of heartless satisfaction. The slaves were huddled together at a little distance, their countenances indicating the sorrow of their hearts. Poor Patsy prayed piteously for mercy, but her prayers were vain. Epps ground his teeth and stamped upon the ground, screaming at me like a mad fiend to strike harder. "Strike harder, or your turn will come next, you scoundrel," he yelled. "Oh, mercy, Massa. Oh, have mercy, do. Oh, God, pity me," Patsy exclaimed continually, struggling fruitlessly, and the flesh quivering at every stroke. When I had struck her as many as 30 times, I stopped and turned round toward Epps, hoping he was satisfied. but with bitter oaths and threats, he ordered me to continue. I inflicted 10 or 15 blows more. By this time her back was covered with long welts, intersecting each other like network. Epps was yet furious and savage as ever, demanding if she would like to go to Shaw's again, and swearing he would flog her until she wished she was in HL. Throwing down the whip, I declared I could punish her no more. He ordered me to go on, threatening me with a severer flogging than she had received, in case of refusal. My heart revolted at the inhuman scene, and risking the consequences, I absolutely refused to raise the whip. He then seized it himself and applied it with tenfold greater force than I had. The painful cries and shrieks of the tortured Patsy, mingling with the loud and angry curses of Epps, loaded the air. She was terribly lacerated, I may say. Without exaggeration, literally flayed. The lash was wet with blood, which flowed down her sides and dropped upon the ground. At length she ceased struggling. Her head sank listlessly on the ground. Her screams and supplications gradually decreased and died away into a low moan. She no longer writhed and shrank beneath the lash when it bit out small pieces of her flesh. I thought that she was dying. It was the Sabbath of the Lord. The fields smiled in the warm sunlight, the birds chirped merrily amidst the foliage of the trees. Peace and happiness seemed to reign everywhere, save in the bosoms of Epps and his panting victim and the silent witnesses around him. The tempestuous emotions that were raging there were little in harmony with the calm and quiet beauty of the day. I could look on Epps only with unutterable loathing and abhorrence, and thought within myself, "Thou devil, sooner or later, somewhere in the course of eternal justice, thou shalt answer for this sin." Finally, he ceased whipping for mere exhaustion, and ordered Phoebe to bring a bucket of salt and water. After washing her thoroughly with this, I was told to take her to her cabin. Untying the ropes, I raised her in my arms. She was unable to stand, and as her head rested on my shoulder, she repeated many times in a faint voice scarcely perceptible, "Oh, Platt," but nothing further. Her dress was replaced, but it clung to her back and was soon stiff with blood. We laid her on some boards in the hut, where she remained a long time, with eyes closed and groaning in agony. At night, Phoebe applied melted tallow to her wounds, and so far as we were able, all endeavored to assist and console her. Day after day, she lay in her cabin upon her face, the sores preventing her resting in any other position. A blessed thing it would have been for her days and weeks and months of misery. It would have saved her had she never lifted up her head in life again. Indeed, from that time forward, she was not what she had been. The burden of a deep melancholy weighed heavily on her spirits. She no longer moved with that buoyant and elastic step. There was not that mirthful sparkle in her eyes that formerly distinguished her. The bounding vigor, the sprightly, laughter-loving spirit of her youth were gone. She fell into a mournful and desponding mood, and oftentimes would start up in her sleep, and with raised hands, plead for mercy. She became more silent than she was, toiling all day in our midst, not uttering a word. A careworn, pitiful expression settled on her face, and it was her humor now to weep rather than rejoice. If ever there was a broken heart, one crushed and blighted by the rude grasp of suffering and misfortune, it was Patsy's. She had been reared no better than her master's beast, looked upon merely as a valuable and handsome animal, and consequently possessed but a limited amount of knowledge. And yet a faint light cast its rays over her intellect, so that it was not wholly dark. She had a dim perception of God and of eternity, and a still more dim perception of a Savior who had died even for such as her. She entertained but confused notions of a future life, not comprehending the distinction between the corporeal and spiritual existence. Happiness, in her mind, was exemption from stripes, from labor, from the cruelty of masters and overseers. Her idea of the joy of heaven was simply rest, and is fully expressed in these lines of a melancholy bard. I ask no paradise on high, with cares on earth oppressed. The only heaven for which I sigh is rest, eternal rest. It is a mistaken opinion that prevails in some quarters, that the slave does not understand the term, does not comprehend the idea of freedom. Even on Bayou Boeuf, where I conceive slavery exists in its most abject and cruel form, where it exhibits features altogether unknown in more northern states, the most ignorant of them generally know full well its meaning. They understand the privileges and exemptions that belong to it, that it would bestow upon them the fruits of their own labors, and that it would secure to them the enjoyment of domestic happiness. They do not fail to observe the difference between their own condition and the meanest white man's, and to realize the injustice of the laws which place it in his power not only to appropriate the profits of their industry, but to subject them to unmerited and unprovoked punishment, without remedy or the right to resist or to remonstrate. Patsy's life, especially after her whipping, was one long dream of liberty, far away, to her fancy, an immeasurable distance. She knew there was a land of freedom. 1,000 times she had heard that somewhere in the distant north there were no slaves, no masters. In her imagination it was an enchanted region, the paradise of the earth. To dwell where the black man may work for himself live in his own cabin till his own soil was a blissful dream of Patsy's, a dream, alas, the fulfillment of which she can never realize. The effect of these exhibitions of brutality on the household of the slaveholder is apparent. Epps' oldest son is an intelligent lad of 10 or 12 years of age. It is pitiable sometimes to see him chastising, for instance, the venerable Uncle Abram. He will call the old man to account, and if in his childish judgment it is necessary, sentence him to a certain number of lashes, which he proceeds to inflict with much gravity and deliberation. Mounted on his pony, he often rides into the field with his whip, playing the overseer, greatly to his father's delight. Without discrimination, at such times he applies the rawhide, urging the slaves forward with shouts and occasional expressions of profanity, while the old man laughs and commends him as a thoroughgoing boy. The child is father to the man, and with such training, whatever may be his natural disposition, it cannot well be otherwise than that, on arriving at maturity, the sufferings and miseries of the slave will be looked upon with entire indifference. The influence of the iniquitous system necessarily fosters an unfeeling and cruel spirit, even in the bosoms of those who among their equals are regarded as humane and generous. Young Master Epps possessed some noble qualities, yet no process of reasoning could lead him to comprehend that in the eye of the Almighty there is no distinction of color. He looked upon the black man simply as an animal, differing in no respect from any other animal, save in the gift of speech and the possession of somewhat higher instincts, and therefore the more valuable. To work like his father's mules, to be whipped and kicked and scourged through life, to address the white man with hat in hand, and eyes bent servilely on the earth, in his mind, was the natural and proper destiny of the slave. Brought up with such ideas and the notion that we stand without the pale of humanity, no wonder the oppressors of my people are a pitiless and unrelenting race. Chapter 18 is where the story changes. Not with a bang, not with a cry, but with a conversation, a chance, a man, a whisper that just might become a key. This chapter introduces Bass, a white carpenter from Canada, and unlike all others before him, Bass sees Solomon not as a tool, not as a beast, but as a man. They speak quietly, away from the ears of Epps. Their words are cautious, but weighted. Solomon, after so many betrayals, holds back. Bass, weary of slavery, but not yet ready to act, asks questions. What unfolds is not a plea, not a demand, but a recognition. 2 men, 2 countries, 2 fates, but one truth. Slavery is wrong, and Solomon, he should not be here. This chapter blooms with a quiet intensity. For the first time in years, Solomon is allowed to speak as Solomon Northup, not as plat, not as property, And Base listens, not as a master, not as a spy, but as a man of conscience. This in itself is radical, because in a world where silence has been survival, to be heard is to begin healing. Base is based on a real man, Samuel Base, a Canadian abolitionist and skilled carpenter. He was one of the rare white men in the South, willing to speak out against slavery, even in whispers. To assist a black man in escaping bondage was a crime. It could end his life, destroy his livelihood, and yet he listens and he believes. This is not heroism born of glory. It is quiet bravery, made of morals stronger than fear. Base is a builder, a man who crafts order from chaos, structure from raw wood. It is no coincidence that he becomes the one to help build Solomon's way out. He isn't flashy, he doesn't boast, but he sees what's wrong and quietly begins to measure, to plan, to act. A carpenter, delivering liberation, like a quiet messiah, in a land without mercy. After the betrayal of Armsby, Solomon had nearly closed off completely. But Base's decency, his outrage and injustice, his willingness to listen without judgment, crack something open. Solomon dares, once again, to believe that there are still good men, that someone might still help him, that his name might still be spoken in freedom. Chapter 18 does not free Solomon, not yet, but it gives him something that may be rarer than freedom itself in this world. A man who believes him, a man who will act. Base becomes more than a character. He becomes the bridge between Solomon's captivity and his home. The road is still perilous. Epps is still watching. Danger still surrounds them like coiled wire. But now, for the first time in years, hope has a name, and it wears a carpenter's hands. Chapter 19. In the month of June 1852, in pursuance of a previous contract, Mr. Avery, a carpenter of Bayou Rouge, commenced the erection of a house for Master Epps. It has previously been stated that there are no cellars on Bayou Boeuf, on the other hand, such as the low and swampy nature of the ground. The great houses are usually built upon spiles. Another peculiarity is the rooms are not plastered, but the ceiling and sides are covered with matched cypress boards, painted such color as most pleases the owner's taste. Generally, the plank and boards are sawed by slaves with whipsaws, there being no water power upon which mills might be built within many miles. When the planter erects for himself a dwelling, therefore, there is plenty of extra work for his slaves. Having had some experience under Tibiats as a carpenter, I was taken from the field altogether on the arrival of Avery and his hands. Among them was one to whom I owe an immeasurable debt of gratitude. Only for him, in all probability, I should have ended my days in slavery. He was my deliverer, a man whose true heart overflowed with noble and generous emotions. To the last moment of my existence, I shall remember him with feelings of thankfulness. His name was Base, and at that time he resided in Marksville. It will be difficult to convey a correct impression of his appearance or character. He was a large man between 40 and 50 years old, of light complexion and light hair. He was very cool and self-possessed, fond of argument, but always speaking with extreme deliberation. He was that kind of person whose peculiarity of manner was such that nothing he uttered ever gave offense. What would be intolerable, coming from the lips of another, could be said by him with impunity. There was not a man on Red River, perhaps, that agreed with him on the subject of politics or religion, and not a man, I venture to say, who discussed either of those subjects half as much. It seemed to be taken for granted that he would espouse the unpopular side of every local question, and it always created amusement rather than displeasure among his auditors, to listen to the ingenious and original manner in which he maintained the controversy. He was a bachelor, an old bachelor, according to the true acceptation of the term, having no kindred living, as he knew of in the world. Neither had he any permanent abiding place, wandering from one state to another, as his fancy dictated. He had lived in Marksville 3 or 4 years, and in the prosecution of his business as a carpenter. and in consequence likewise of his peculiarities, was quite extensively known throughout the parish of Avoyelles. He was liberal to a fault, and his many acts of kindness and transparent goodness of heart rendered him popular in the community, the sentiment of which he unceasingly combated. He was a native of Canada, from whence he had wandered in early life, and after visiting all the principal localities in the northern and western states in the course of his peregrinations, arrived in the unhealthy region of the Red River. His last removal was from Illinois, whither he has now gone, I regret to be obliged to say, is unknown to me. He gathered up his effects and departed quietly from Marksville the day before I did. The suspicions of his instrumentality in procuring my liberation rendering such a step necessary. For the commission of a just and righteous act, he would undoubtedly have suffered death, had he remained within reach of the slave-whipping tribe on Bayou Boeuf. One day, while working on the new house, Bass and Epps became engaged in a controversy, to which, as will be readily supposed, I listened with absorbing interest. They were discussing the subject of slavery. "I tell you what it is, Epps," said Bass. "It's all wrong. So there's no justice nor righteousness in it. I wouldn't own a slave if I was rich as Croesus, which I am not, as is perfectly well understood, more particularly among my creditors. There's another humbug, the credit system humbug. Sir, no credit, no debt. Credit leads a man into temptation. Cash down is the only thing that will deliver him from evil. But this question of slavery, what right have you to your niggers when you come down to the point?" "What right?" said Epp, laughing. "Why, I bought 'em and paid for 'em." "Of course you did. The law says you have the right to hold a nigger, but begging the law's pardon, it lies. Yes, Epps, when the law says that it's a liar, and the truth is not in it, is everything right because the law allows it? Suppose they'd pass a law taking away your liberty and making you a slave." "Oh, that ain't a supposable case," said Epps, still laughing. "Hope you don't compare me to a nigger, Bass." "Well," Bass answered gravely, "no, not exactly. But I have seen niggers before now as good as I am, and I have no acquaintance with any white man in these parts that I consider a whit better than myself. Now, in the sight of God, what is the difference, Epps, between a white man and a black one?" "All the difference in the world," replied Epps. "You might as well ask what the difference is between a white man and a baboon. Now, I've seen one of them critters in Orleans that knowed just as much as any nigger I've got. He'd call them feller citizens, I suppose." And Epps indulged in a loud laugh at his own wit. "Look here, Epps," continued his companion. "You can't laugh me down in that way. Some men are witty, and some ain't so witty as they think they are. Now, let me ask you a question. Are all men created free and equal as the Declaration of Independence holds they are?" "Yes," responded Epps, "but all men niggers and monkeys ain't." And hereupon he broke forth into a more boisterous laugh than before. "There are monkeys among white people as well as black. When you come to that," coolly remarked Bass, "I know some white men that use arguments no sensible monkey would. But let that pass. These niggers are human beings. If they don't know as much as their masters, whose fault is it? They are not allowed to know anything. You have books and papers and can go where you please and gather intelligence in 1,000 ways. But your slaves have no privileges. You'd whip one of them if caught reading a book. They are held in bondage generation after generation, deprived of mental improvement, and who can expect them to possess much knowledge? If they are not brought down to a level with the brute creation, you slaveholders will never be blamed for it. If they are baboons or stand no higher in the scale of intelligence than such animals, you and men like you will have to answer for it. There is a sin, a fearful sin, resting on this nation, that will not go unpunished forever. There will be a reckoning, yet yes, Epps, there's a day coming that will burn as an oven. It may be sooner or it may be later, but it's a coming as sure as the Lord is just. If you lived up among the Yankees in New England, said Epps, I expect you'd be one of them cursed fanatics that know more than the Constitution and go about peddling clocks and coaxing niggers to run away. If I was in New England, returned Bass, I would be just what I am here. I would say that slavery was an iniquity and ought to be abolished. I would say there was no reason nor justice in the law or the Constitution that allows one man to hold another man in bondage. It would be hard for you to lose your property, to be sure, but it wouldn't be half as hard as it would be to lose your liberty. You have no more right to your freedom in exact justice than Uncle Abram yonder. Talk about black skin and black blood. Why, how many slaves are there on this bayou, as white as either of us? And what difference is there in the color of the soul? Sure, the whole system is as absurd as it is cruel. You may own niggers and be hanged, but I wouldn't own one for the best plantation in Louisiana. You like to hear yourself talk, Bass, better than any man I know of. You would argue that black was white, or white black, if anybody would contradict you. Nothing suits you in this world, and I don't believe you will be satisfied with the next, if you should have your choice in them. Conversations substantially like the foregoing were not unusual between the two after this, Epps drawing him out more for the purpose of creating a laugh at his expense than with a view of fairly discussing the merits of the question. He looked upon Bass as a man ready to say anything merely for the pleasure of hearing his own voice, as somewhat self-conceited perhaps, contending against his faith and judgment in order simply to exhibit his dexterity in argumentation. He remained at Epps through the summer, visiting Marksville generally once a fortnight. The more I saw of him, the more I became convinced he was a man in whom I could confide. Nevertheless, my previous ill fortune had taught me to be extremely cautious. It was not my place to speak to a white man except when spoken to, but I omitted no opportunity of throwing myself in his way, and endeavored constantly in every possible manner to attract his attention. In the early part of August, he and myself were at work alone in the house, the other carpenters having left, and Epps being absent in the field. Now was the time, if ever, to broach the subject, and I resolved to do it, and submit to whatever consequences might ensue. We were busily at work in the afternoon, when I stopped suddenly and said, "Master Bass, I want to ask you what part of the country you came from." "Why, Platt, what put that into your head?" he answered. "You wouldn't know if I should tell you." After a moment or two, he added, "I was born in Canada. Now guess where that is." "Oh, I know where Canada is," said I. "I have been there myself." "Yes, I expect you are well acquainted all through that country," he remarked, laughing incredulously. "As sure as I live, Master Bass," I replied, "I have been there. I have been in Montreal and Kingston and Queenston and a great many places in Canada, and I have been in York State, too, in Buffalo and Rochester and Albany, and can tell you the names of the villages on the Erie Canal and the Champlain Canal." Bass turned round and gazed at me a long time without uttering a syllable. "How came you here?" he inquired at length. "Master Bass," I answered, "if justice had been done, I never would have been here." "Well, how's this?" said he. "Who are you? You have been in Canada, sure enough. I know all the places you mention. How did you happen to get here? Come, tell me all about it." "I have no friends here," was my reply, "that I can put confidence in. I am afraid to tell you, though I don't believe you would tell Master Epps if I should." He assured me earnestly he would keep every word I might speak to him a profound secret, and his curiosity was evidently strongly excited. It was a long story, I informed him, and would take some time to relate it. Master Epps would be back soon, but if he would see me that night after all were asleep, I would repeat it to him. He consented readily to the arrangement, and directed me to come into the building where we were then at work, and I would find him there. About midnight, when all was still and quiet, I crept cautiously from my cabin, and silently entering the unfinished building, found him awaiting me, after further assurances on his part that I should not be betrayed. I began a relation of the history of my life and misfortunes. He was deeply interested, asking numerous questions in reference to localities and events. Having ended my story, I besought him to write to some of my friends at the North, acquainting them with my situation, and begging them to forward free papers, or take such steps as they might consider proper to secure my release. He promised to do so, but dwelt upon the danger of such an act in case of detection, and now impressed upon me the great necessity of strict silence and secrecy. Before we parted, our plan of operation was arranged. We agreed to meet the next night at a specified place among the high weeds on the bank of the bayou, some distance from Master's dwelling. There he was to write down on paper the names and address of several persons, old friends in the North, to whom he would direct letters during his next visit to Marksville. It was not deemed prudent to meet in the new house, inasmuch as the light it would be necessary to use might possibly be discovered. In the course of the day, I managed to obtain a few matches and a piece of candle unperceived from the kitchen, during a temporary absence of Aunt Phoebe. Bass had pencil and paper in his tool chest. At the appointed hour, we met on the bayou bank, and creeping among the high weeds, I lighted the candle, while he drew forth pencil and paper and prepared for business. I gave him the names of William Perry, Cephas Parker, and Judge Marvin, all of Saratoga Springs, Saratoga County, New York. I had been employed by the latter in the United States Hotel, and had transacted business with the former to a considerable extent, and trusted that at least one of them would be still living at that place. He carefully wrote the names, and then remarked thoughtfully, "It is so many years since you left Saratoga. All these men may be dead, or may have removed. You say you obtained papers at the Custom House in New York. Probably there is a record of them there, and I think it would be well to write and ascertain." I agreed with him, and again repeated the circumstances related heretofore, connected with my visit to the Custom House with Brown and Hamilton. We lingered on the bank of the bayou an hour or more, conversing upon the subject which now engrossed our thoughts. I could no longer doubt his fidelity, and freely spoke to him of the many sorrows I had borne in silence and so long. I spoke of my wife and children, mentioning their names and ages, and dwelling upon the unspeakable happiness it would be to clasp them to my heart once more before I died. I caught him by the hand, and with tears and passionate entreaties implored him to befriend me, to restore me to my kindred, and a liberty promising I would weary heaven the remainder of my life with prayers that it would bless and prosper him. In enjoyment of freedom, surrounded by the associations of youth, and restored to the bosom of my family, that promise is not yet forgotten, nor shall it ever be so long as I have strength to raise my imploring eyes on high. Oh, blessings on his kindly voice and on his silver hair, and blessings on his whole life long, until he meet me there. He overwhelmed me with assurances of friendship and faithfulness, saying he had never before taken so deep an interest in the fate of any one. He spoke of himself in a somewhat mournful tone, as a lonely man, a wanderer about the world, that he was growing old, and must soon reach the end of his earthly journey, and lie down to his final rest without kith or kin to mourn for him, or to remember him that his life was of little value to himself, and henceforth should be devoted to the accomplishment of my liberty, and to an unceasing warfare against the accursed shame of slavery. After this time we seldom spoke to or recognized each other. He was, moreover, less free in his conversation with Epps on the subject of slavery. The remotest suspicion that there was any unusual intimacy, any secret understanding between us never once entered the mind of Epps or any other person, white or black, on the plantation. I am often asked, with an air of incredulity, how I succeeded so many years in keeping from my daily and constant companions the knowledge of my true name and history. The terrible lesson Birch taught me impressed indelibly upon my mind the danger and uselessness of asserting I was a freeman. There was no possibility of any slave being able to assist me, while on the other hand, there was a possibility of his exposing me. When it is recollected, the whole current of my thoughts for 12 years turned to the contemplation of escape, it will not be wondered at that I was always cautious and on my guard. It would have been an act of folly to have proclaimed my right to freedom, It would only have subjected me to severest scrutiny, probably have consigned me to some more distant and inaccessible region than even Bayou Boeuf. Edwin Epps was a person utterly regardless of a black man's rights or wrongs, utterly destitute of any natural sense of justice, as I well knew. It was important, therefore, not only as regarded my hope of deliverance, but also as regarded the few personal privileges I was permitted to enjoy, to keep from him the history of my life. The Saturday night subsequent to our interview at the water's edge, Bass went home to Marksville. The next day, being Sunday, he employed himself in his own room, writing letters. One he directed to the Collector of Customs at New York, another to Judge Marvin, and another to Messrs. Parker and Perry jointly. The latter was the one which led to my recovery. He subscribed my true name, but in the postscript intimated I was not the writer. The letter itself shows that he considered himself engaged in a dangerous undertaking no less than running the risk of his life, if detected. I did not see the letter before it was mailed, but have since obtained a copy, which is here inserted. Bayou Boeuf, August 15th, 1852. M.R. William Perry, or M.R. Cephas Parker. Gentlemen, it having been a long time since I have seen or heard from you, and not knowing that you are living, it is with uncertainty that I write to you. But the necessity of the case must be my excuse. Having been born free just across the river from you, I am certain you must know me, and I am here now a slave. I wish you to obtain free papers for me, and forward them to me at Marksville, Louisiana, parish of Avoyelles, and oblige yours, Solomon Northup. The way I came to be a slave, I was taken sick in Washington City, and was insensible for some time. When I recovered my reason, I was robbed of my free papers, and in irons on my way to this date, and have never been able to get anyone to write for me until now. And he that is writing for me runs the risk of his life if detected. The allusion to myself in the work recently issued, entitled The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, contains the first part of this letter, omitting the postscript. Neither are the full names of the gentlemen to whom it is directed correctly stated, there being a slight discrepancy, probably a typographical error. To the postscript more than to the body of the communication am I indebted for my liberation, as will presently be seen. When Bass returned from Marksville, he informed me of what he had done. We continued our midnight consultations, never speaking to each other through the day, excepting as it was necessary about the work. As nearly as he was able to ascertain, it would require 2 weeks for the letter to reach Saratoga in due course of mail, and the same length of time for an answer to return. Within 6 weeks at the farthest, we concluded, an answer would arrive, if it arrived at all. A great many suggestions were now made, and a great deal of conversation took place between us as to the most safe and proper course to pursue on receipt of the free papers. They would stand between him and harm in case we were overtaken and arrested, leaving the country altogether. It would be no infringement of law, however much it might provoke individual hostility, to assist a freeman to regain his freedom. At the end of 4 weeks, he was again at Marksville, but no answer had arrived. I was sorely disappointed, but still reconciled myself with the reflection that sufficient length of time had not yet elapsed, that there might have been delays, and that I could not reasonably expect one so soon. 6, 7, 8, and 10 weeks passed by, however, and nothing came. I was in a fever of suspense whenever Bass visited Marksville, and could scarcely close my eyes until his return. Finally, my master's house was finished, and the time came when Bass must leave me. The night before his departure, I was wholly given up to despair. I had clung to him as a drowning man clings to the floating spar, knowing if it slips from his grasp, he must forever sink beneath the waves. The all-glorious hope upon which I had laid such eager hold was crumbling to ashes in my hands. I felt as if sinking down amidst the bitter waters of slavery, from the unfathomable depths of which I should never rise again. The generous heart of my friend and benefactor was touched with pity at the sight of my distress. He endeavored to cheer me up, promising to return the day before Christmas. And if no intelligence was received in the meantime, some further step would be undertaken to effect our design. He exhorted me to keep up my spirits, to rely upon his continued efforts in my behalf, assuring me, in most earnest and impressive language, that my liberation should, from thenceforth, be the chief object of his thoughts. In his absence, the time passed slowly indeed. I looked forward to Christmas with intense anxiety and impatience. I had about given up the expectation of receiving any answer to the letters. They might have miscarried, or might have been misdirected. Perhaps those at Saratoga, to whom they had been addressed, were all dead. Perhaps, engaged in their pursuits, they did not consider the fate of an obscure, unhappy black man of sufficient importance to be noticed. My whole reliance was in base. The faith I had in him was continually reassuring me, and enabled me to stand up against the tide of disappointment that had overwhelmed me. So wholly was I absorbed in reflecting upon my situation and prospects, that the hands with whom I labored in the field often observed it. Patsy would ask me if I was sick, and Uncle Abram and Bob and Wiley frequently expressed a curiosity to know what I could be thinking about so steadily. But I evaded their inquiries with some light remark, and kept my thoughts locked closely in my breast. Chapter 19 is a sacred moment. No chains are broken, no guns are fired, no gates swing open, and yet, in this chapter, freedom begins. It is not loud, it is not triumphant, it is a letter written in secret, sealed in trust, and carried on a whisper of hope through the dangerous corridors of the South. In the stillness of night, or in the stolen slivers of day, Solomon dictates his truth to Base. Base, with steady hands, writes word after word, a lifeline disguised as ink. Every sentence holds Solomon's history, his name, his abduction, his captors. This is not just a letter. It is proof. It is a voice returning from a grave. It is Solomon's soul, pressed flat onto paper, refusing to be silenced any longer. This moment hangs on the edge of a blade. One letter, one messenger, one misstep, and the dream collapses. Base isn't a warrior. He isn't armed, but he is brave, in a way most men in the South never dared to be. He promises to send the letter to Saratoga, New York, to the men who might still remember Solomon, to those who might yet act. This is the leap. Solomon has waited over a decade for this moment, and now it is out of his hands. Few slaves had the chance to tell their stories. Even fewer had the chance to write to the North and live to see a reply. But Solomon's circumstances were unique. He had been free. He had friends. He had a paper trail. And now, he had a voice brave enough to carry his words across state lines. The journey of the letter would not be swift, nor safe. But this was the first real chance Solomon had to shake the foundation of his captivity, not with violence, but with truth. In a world where Solomon's name had all but vanished, the letter restores it. Every word brings back a piece of him, long buried beneath cotton and suffering. It is more than correspondence. It is resurrection, and Base, humble and steadfast, becomes the unlikely apostle of justice, his hands delivering salvation where laws had failed. And now Solomon waits. The letter is sent, the plea has gone out, and the plantation remains unchanged. Ep still rants, Patsy still weeps, the cotton still grows. But Solomon, he now walks differently, because inside him a storm has begun to stir, not of anger, but of anticipation. A tide has turned, and all he can do now is endure the days ahead until someone answers, until someone comes. In chapter 19, we do not see escape. We see something more dangerous. We see hope given a direction. A man enslaved for 12 years has finally spoken his name through the hands of another and sent it flying toward justice. The letter is gone. The waiting has begun. And somewhere, far to the north, a door may be opening. Chapter 20. Faithful to his word. The day before Christmas, just at nightfall, Base came riding into the yard. "How are you?" said Epps, shaking him by the hand. "Glad to see you." He would not have been very glad had he known the object of his errand. Quite well, answered Base. "Had some business out on the bayou, and concluded to call and see you and stay overnight." Epps ordered one of the slaves to take charge of his horse, and with much talk and laughter they passed into the house together. Not, however, until Base had looked at me significantly, as much as to say, "Keep dark, we understand each other." It was 10 o'clock at night before the labors of the day were performed when I entered the cabin. At that time Uncle Abram and Bob occupied it with me. I laid down upon my board and feigned I was asleep, when my companions had fallen into a profound slumber. I moved stealthily out of the door and watched, and listened attentively for some sign or sound from Base. There I stood until long after midnight, but nothing could be seen or heard. As I suspected, he dared not leave the house, through fear of exciting the suspicion of some of the family. I judged correctly he would rise earlier than was his custom, and take the opportunity of seeing me before Epps was up. Accordingly, I aroused Uncle Abram an hour sooner than usual, and sent him into the house to build a fire, which, at that season of the year, is a part of Uncle Abram's duties. I also gave Bob a violent shake, and asked him if he intended to sleep till noon, saying Master would be up before the mules were fed. He knew right what consequence that would follow such an event, and, jumping to his feet, was at the horse pasture in a twinkling. Presently, when both were gone, Base slipped into the cabin. "No letter yet, Platt," said he. The announcement fell upon my heart like lead. "Oh, do write again, Master Base," I cried. "I will give you the names of a great many I know. Surely they are not all dead. Surely someone will pity me." "No use," Base replied, "no use. I have made up my mind to that. I fear the Marksville postmaster will mistrust something. I have inquired so often at his office. Too uncertain, too dangerous." "Then it is all over," I exclaimed. "Oh, my God, how can I end my days here?" "You're not going to end them here," he said, "unless you die very soon. I've thought this matter all over, and have come to a determination. There are more ways than one to manage this business, and a better and surer way than writing letters. I have a job or two on hand which can be completed by March or April. By that time I shall have a considerable sum of money. And then, Platt, I'm going to Saratoga myself." I could scarcely credit my own senses as the words fell from his lips, but he assured me, in a manner that left no doubt of the sincerity of his intention, that if his life was spared until spring, he should certainly undertake the journey. "I have lived in this region long enough," he continued. "I may as well be in one place as another. For a long time I have been thinking of going back once more to the place where I was born. I'm tired of slavery as well as you. If I can succeed in getting you away from here, it will be a good act that I shall like to think of all my life. And I shall succeed, Platt. I'm bound to do it. Now let me tell you what I want. Epps will be up soon, and it won't do to be caught here. Think of a great many men at Saratoga and Sandy Hill, and in that neighborhood, who once knew you. I shall make excuse to come here again in the course of the winter, when I will write down their names. I will then know who to call on when I go north. Think of all you can. Cheer up. Don't be discouraged. I'm with you life or death. Goodbye. God bless you." And saying this, he left the cabin quickly and entered the great house. It was Christmas morning, the happiest day in the whole year for the slave. That morning he need not hurry to the field with his gourd and cotton bag. Happiness sparkled in the eyes and overspread the countenances of all. The time of feasting and dancing had come. The cane and cotton fields were deserted. That day the clean dress was to be donned, the red ribbon displayed. There were to be reunions and joy and laughter and hurrying to and fro. It was to be a day of liberty among the children of slavery. Wherefore they were happy and rejoiced. After breakfast, Epps and Base sauntered about the yard, conversing upon the price of cotton and various other topics. "Where do your niggers hold Christmas?" Bass inquired. "Platt is going to Tanner's today. His fiddle is in great demand. They want him at Marshall's Monday, and Miss Mary McCoy on the old Norwood plantation writes me a note that she want him to play for her niggers Tuesday. He is rather a smart boy, ain't he?" said Bass. "Come here, Platt," he added, looking at me as I walked up to them, as if he had never thought before to take any special notice of me. "Yes," replied Epps, taking hold of my arm and feeling it. "There isn't a bad joint in him. There ain't a boy on the bayou worth more than he is perfectly sound, and no bad tricks. And him, he isn't like other niggers. Doesn't look like him, don't act like M. I was offered $1,700 for him last week." "And didn't take it?" Bass inquired, with an air of surprise. "Take it, no. Devilish clear of it. Why, he's a regular genius. Can make a plow beam, wag and tongue anything, as well as you can. Marshall wanted to put up one of his niggers, egging him and raffle for them. But I told him I would see the devil have him first." "I don't see anything remarkable about him," Bass observed. "Why, just feel of him now," Epps rejoined. "You don't see a boy very often put together any closer than he is. He's a thin-skinned cuss and won't bear as much whipping as some. But he's got the muscle in him, and no mistake." Bass fell to me, turned me round, and made a thorough examination, Epps all the while dwelling on my good points. But his visitor seemed to take but little interest finally in the subject, and consequently it was dropped. Bass soon departed, giving me another sly look of recognition and significance as he trotted out of the yard. When he was gone, I obtained a pass and started for Tanner's, not Peter Tanner's, of whom mention has previously been made, but a relative of his. I played during the day and most of the night, spending the next day, Sunday, in my cabin. Monday, I crossed the bayou to Douglas Marshall's, all Epps slaves accompanying me, and on Tuesday went to the old Norwood place, which is a third plantation above Marshall's, on the same side of the water. This estate is now owned by Miss Mary McCoy, a lovely girl, some 20 years of age. She is the beauty and the glory of Bayou Burf. She owns about 100 working hands, besides a great many house servants, yard boys, and young children. Her brother-in-law, who resides on the adjoining estate, is her general agent. She is beloved by all her slaves, and good reason indeed have they to be thankful that they have fallen into such gentle hands. Nowhere on the bayou are there such feasts, such merrymaking, as at young Madame McCoy's. Thither, more than to any other place, do the old and the young for miles around love to repair in the time of the Christmas holidays. For nowhere else can they find such delicious repasts. Nowhere else can they hear a voice speaking to them so pleasantly. No one is so well beloved, no one fills so large a space in the hearts of 1,000 slaves, as young Madame McCoy, the orphan mistress of the old Norwood estate. On my arrival at her place, I found 200 or 300 had assembled. The table was prepared in a long building, which she had erected expressly for her slaves to dance in. It was covered with every variety of food the country afforded, and was pronounced by general acclamation to be the rarest of dinners. Roast turkey, pig, chicken, duck, and all kinds of meat baked, boiled, and broiled form a line the whole length of the extended table, while the vacant spaces were filled with tarts, jellies, and frosted cake, and pastry of many kinds. The young mistress walked around the table, smiling and saying a kind word to each one, and seemed to enjoy the scene exceedingly. When the dinner was over, the tables were removed to make room for the dancers. I tuned my violin and struck up a lively air, while some joined in a nimble reel. Others patted and sang their simple but melodious songs, filling the great room with music mingled with the sound of human voices and the clatter of many feet. In the evening, the mistress returned and stood in the door a long time, looking at us. She was magnificently arrayed. Her dark hair and eyes contrasted strongly with her clear and delicate complexion. Her form was slender but commanding, and her movement was a combination of unaffected dignity and grace. As she stood there, clad in her rich apparel, her face animated with pleasure, I thought I had never looked upon a human being half so beautiful. I dwell with delight upon the description of this fair and gentle lady, not only because she inspired me with emotions of gratitude and admiration, but because I would have the reader understand that all slave owners on Bayou Boeuf are not like Epps or Tibietz or Jim Burns. Occasionally can be found, rarely it may be indeed, a good man like William Ford, or an angel of kindness like young Mistress McCoy. Tuesday concluded the 3 holidays Epps yearly allowed us. On my way home, Wednesday morning, while passing the plantation of William Pierce, that gentleman hailed me, saying he had received a line from Epps, brought down by William Varnell, permitting him to detain me for the purpose of playing for his slaves that night. It was the last time I was destined to witness a slave dance on the shores of Bayou Boeuf. The party at Pierce's continued their jollification until broad daylight, when I returned to my master's house, somewhat wearied with the loss of rest, but rejoicing in the possession of numerous bits and picayunes, which the whites, who were pleased with my musical performances, had contributed. On Saturday morning, for the first time in years, I overslept myself. I was frightened on coming out of the cabin to find the slaves were already in the field. They had preceded me some 15 minutes. Leaving my dinner and water gourd, I hurried after them as fast as I could move. It was not yet sunrise, but Epps was on the piazza as I left the hut, and cried out to me that it was a pretty time of day to be getting up. By extra exertion, my row was up when he came out after breakfast. This, however, was no excuse for the offense of oversleeping. Bidding me strip and lie down, he gave me 10 or 15 lashes, at the conclusion of which he inquired if I thought, after that, I could get up sometime in the morning. I expressed myself quite positively that I could, and, with back stinging with pain, went about my work. The following day, Sunday, my thoughts were upon Base, and the probabilities and hopes which hung upon his action and determination. I considered the uncertainty of life, that if it should be the will of God that he should die, my prospect of deliverance, and all expectation of happiness in this world, would be wholly ended and destroyed. My sore back, perhaps, did not have a tendency to render me unusually cheerful. I felt downhearted and unhappy all day long, and when I laid down upon the hard board at night, my heart was oppressed with such a load of grief. It seemed that it must break. Monday morning, the 3rd of January, 1853, we were in the field betimes. It was a raw, cold morning, such as is unusual in that region. I was in advance, Uncle Abram next to me, behind him Bob, Patsy, and Wiley, with our cotton bags about our necks. Epps happened, a rare thing indeed, to come out that morning without his whip. He swore, in a manner that would shame a pirate, that we were doing nothing. Bob ventured to say that his fingers were so numb with cold he couldn't pick fast. Epps cursed himself for not having brought his rawhide, and declared that when he came out again he would warm us well. Yes, he would make us all hotter than that fiery realm in which I am sometimes compelled to believe he will himself eventually reside. With these fervent expressions, he left us. When out of hearing, we commenced talking to each other, saying how hard it was to be compelled to keep up our tasks with numb fingers, how unreasonable Master was, and speaking of him generally in no flattering terms. Our conversation was interrupted by a carriage passing rapidly toward the house. Looking up, we saw 2 men approaching us through the cotton field. Having now brought down this narrative to the last hour I was to spend on Bayou Boeuf, having gotten to my last cotton picking, and about to bid Master Epps farewell, I must beg the reader to go back with me to the month of August, to follow Base Letter on its long journey to Saratoga, to learn the effect it produced, and that, while I was repining and despairing in the slave hut of Edwin Epps, through the friendship of Base and the goodness of Providence, all things were working together for my deliverance. Chapter 20 is not the climax. but it is the drumbeat before the charge. After years of silence, after betrayal and broken hope, Solomon's voice has reached home. The letter has found its mark. Justice is finally stirred, and somewhere far away, in New York, in courtrooms, in quiet offices, men begin to move. For so long, Solomon has been isolated, a lone voice beneath the crush of cotton and cruelty. But now, he is no longer alone. Henry B. Northup, a man of principle, a relative of Solomon's former owner, reads the letter. And unlike Armsby, unlike the countless who turn away, he acts. He takes Solomon's cause to court. He gathers proof. He secures permission from the governor of New York, because freeing a man from slavery in the Deep South is not as simple as stating the truth. It requires documents, strategy, and the will to face danger. This chapter walks a tightrope between legal red tape and moral urgency. The courts are slow. The laws are twisted. Even as Solomon's name is now in motion, his freedom is not guaranteed. But this movement, this recognition, is something we haven't seen in 20 chapters. For the first time, the system Solomon was stolen from has begun to fight to reclaim him. And it all began with a letter scratched in secret by a Canadian carpenter on a southern plantation. The events of this chapter are historically accurate. New York had passed legislation known as the Northup Act to protect its free black citizens kidnapped into slavery. But for that law to matter, someone had to speak, someone had to believe, someone had to move. Henry B. Northup did. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was a lawyer, a man of procedure. And yet in this story, he becomes a rescuer, not with a sword, but with a signature that Solomon's suffering had always been personal, but now it becomes political. The law, once complicit in his capture, now begins to swing in his favor. It is slow. It is imperfect. It may fail, but for the first time, Solomon is visible. His name exists again in the halls of power. He is no longer just Platt to Epps. He is Solomon Northup, a man with a birth certificate, a family, and a claim the world must reckon with. Solomon doesn't yet know. On the plantation, he still works, still watches, still waits. He still bears the weight of 100 past betrayals. But we as readers, we begin to feel the stirrings of something monumental. This is the moment in a symphony when the violins swell, the timpani rumbles, and the conductor draws a long breath. Before the final movement, justice is walking toward him, and it is no longer a dream. In chapter 20, freedom is no longer just a memory. It is a letter, becoming a conversation, becoming a petition, becoming a rescue. The wheels of justice have begun to turn, slow, creaking, imperfect. But Solomon's story is no longer buried beneath cotton. It has crossed state lines. It has crossed hearts. And soon, it will cross the threshold of the place that bound him. The end is near. And for the first time in 12 years, so is home. Chapter 21. I am indebted to Mr. Henry B. Northup and others for many of the particulars contained in this chapter. The letter written by Bass directed to Parker and Perry, and which was deposited in the post office in Marksville on the 15th day of August, 1852, arrived at Saratoga in the early part of September. Sometime previous to this, and had removed to Glens Falls, Warren County, where she had charge of the kitchen in Carpenter's Hotel. She kept house, however, lodging with our children, and was only absent from them during such time as the discharge of her duties in the hotel required. Messrs. Parker and Perry, on receipt of the letter, forwarded it immediately to, and on reading it the children were all excitement, and without delay hastened to the neighboring village of Sandy Hill to consult Henry B. Northup and obtain his advice and assistance in the matter. Upon examination, that gentleman found among the statutes of the state an act providing for the recovery of free citizens from slavery. It was passed May 14, 1840, and is entitled An Act More Effectually to Protect the Free Citizens of this State from being Kidnapped or Reduced to Slavery. It provides that it shall be the duty of the governor upon the receipt of satisfactory information that any free citizen or inhabitant of this state is wrongfully held in another state or territory of the United States, upon the allegation or pretense that such person is a slave, or by color of any usage or rule of law is deemed or taken to be a slave, to take such measures to procure the restoration of such person to liberty as he shall deem necessary. And to that end he is authorized to appoint and employ an agent, and directed to furnish him with such credentials and instructions as will be likely to accomplish the object of his appointment. It requires the agent so appointed to proceed to collect the proper proof to establish the right of such person to his freedom, to perform such journeys, take such measures, institute such legal proceedings, and c. as may be necessary to return such person to this state, and charges all expenses incurred in carrying the act into effect, upon monies not otherwise appropriated in the Treasury. It was necessary to establish two facts to the satisfaction of the governor. First, that I was a free citizen of New York, and secondly, that I was wrongfully held in bondage. As to the first point, there was no difficulty, all the older inhabitants in the vicinity being ready to testify to it. The second point rested entirely upon the letter to Parker and Perry, written in an unknown hand, and upon the letter penned on board the brig Orleans, which, unfortunately, had been mislaid or lost. A memorial was prepared, directed to His Excellency Governor Hunt, setting forth their marriage, my departure to Washington City, the receipt of the letters, that I was a free citizen, and such other facts as were deemed important, and was signed and verified by and accompanying this memorial were several affidavits of prominent citizens of Sandy Hill and Fort Edward, corroborating fully the statements it contained, and also a request of several well-known gentlemen to the governor that Henry B. Northup be appointed agent under the legislative act. On reading the memorial and affidavits, His Excellency took a lively interest in the matter, and on the 23rd day of November 1852, under the seal of the state, constituted, appointed and employed Henry B. Northup, Esq., an agent, with full power to effect my restoration, and to take such measures as would be most likely to accomplish it, and instructing him to proceed to Louisiana with all convenient dispatch. The pressing nature of Mr. Northup's professional and political engagements delayed his departure until December. On the 14th day of that month, he left Sandy Hill and proceeded to Washington. The Honorable Pierre Sol, Senator in Congress from Louisiana, Honorable Mr. Conrad, Secretary of War, and Judge Nelson of the Supreme Court of the United States, upon hearing a statement of the facts and examining his commission and certified copies of the memorial and affidavits, furnished him with open letters to gentlemen in Louisiana, strongly urging their assistance in accomplishing the object of his appointment. Senator Sol especially interested himself in the matter, insisting in forcible language that it was the duty and interest of every planter in his state to aid in restoring me to freedom, and trusted the sentiments of honor and justice in the bosom of every citizen of the Commonwealth would enlist him at once in my behalf. Having obtained these valuable letters, Mr. Northup returned to Baltimore and proceeded from thence to Pittsburgh. It was his original intention, under advice of friends at Washington, to go directly to New Orleans and consult the authorities of that city. Providentially, however, on arriving at the mouth of Red River, he changed his mind. Had he continued on, he would not have met with base, in which case the search for me would probably have been fruitless. Taking passage on the first steamer that arrived, he pursued his journey up Red River, a sluggish winding stream, flowing through a vast region of primitive forests and impenetrable swamps, almost wholly destitute of inhabitants. About 9 o'clock in the forenoon, January 1st, 1853, he left the steamboat at Marksville and proceeded directly to Marksville Courthouse, a small village for miles in the interior. From the fact that the letter to Messrs. Parker and Perry was postmarked at Marksville, it was supposed by him that I was in that place or its immediate vicinity, On reaching this town, he at once laid his business before the Honorable John P. Waddell, a legal gentleman of distinction, and a man of fine genius and most noble impulses. After reading the letters and documents presented him, and listening to a representation of the circumstances under which I had been carried away into captivity, Mr. Waddell at once proffered his services, and entered into the affair with great zeal and earnestness. He, in common with others of like elevated character, looked upon the kidnapper with abhorrence. The title of his fellow parishioners and clients to the property which constituted the larger proportion of their wealth not only depended upon the good faith in which slave sales were transacted, but he was a man in whose honorable heart emotions of indignation were aroused by such an instance of injustice. Marksville, although occupying a prominent position and standing out in impressive italics on the map of Louisiana, is, in fact, but a small and insignificant hamlet, aside from the tavern, kept by a jolly and generous Boniface, the courthouse, inhabited by lawless cows and swine in the seasons of vacation, and a high gallows, with its dissevered rope dangling in the air. There is little to attract the attention of the stranger. Solomon Northup was a name Mr. Waddell had never heard, but he was confident that if there was a slave bearing that appellation in Marksville or vicinity, his black boy Tom would know him. Tom was accordingly called, but in all his extensive circle of acquaintances there was no such personage. The letter to Parker and Perry was dated at Bayou Boeuf. At this place, therefore, the conclusion was I must be sought, but here a difficulty suggested itself, of a very grave character indeed. Bayou Boeuf at its nearest point was 23 miles distant, and was the name applied to the section of country extending between 50 and 100 miles on both sides of that stream. Thousands and thousands of slaves resided upon its shores, the remarkable richness and fertility of the soil having attracted thither a great number of planters. The information in the letter was so vague and indefinite as to render it difficult to conclude upon any specific course of proceeding. It was finally determined, however, as the only plan that presented any prospect of success, that Northup and the brother of Waddell, a student in the office of the latter, should repair to the bayou, and traveling up one side and down the other its whole length, inquire at each plantation for me. Mr. Waddell tendered the use of his carriage, and it was definitely arranged that they should start upon the excursion early Monday morning. It will be seen at once that this course, in all probability, would have resulted unsuccessfully. It would have been impossible for them to have gone into the fields and examined all the gangs at work. They were not aware that I was known only as Platt, and had they inquired of Epps himself, he would have stated truly that he knew nothing of Solomon Northup. The arrangement being adopted, however, there was nothing further to be done until Sunday had elapsed. The conversation between Messrs. Northup and Waddell in the course of the afternoon turned upon New York politics. I can scarcely comprehend the nice distinctions and shades of political parties in your state, observed Mr. Waddell. I read of soft shells and hard shells, hunkers and barn burners, woolly heads and silver grays, and am unable to understand the precise difference between them. Pray, what is it? Mr. Northup, refilling his pipe, entered into quite an elaborate narrative of the origin of the various sections of parties, and concluded by saying there was another party in New York, known as Free Soilers or Abolitionists. You have seen none of those in this part of the country, I presume? Mr. Northup remarked. Never but one, answered Waddell laughingly. We have one here in Marksville, an eccentric creature who preaches abolitionism as vehemently as any fanatic at the North. He is a generous and offensive man, but always maintaining the wrong side of an argument. It affords us a deal of amusement. He is an excellent mechanic and almost indispensable in this community. He is a carpenter. His name is Bass. Some further good-natured conversation was had at the expense of Bass' peculiarities, when Waddell all at once fell into a reflective mood and asked for the mysterious letter again. Let me see, Letmese, he repeated, thoughtfully to himself, running his eyes over the letter once more. Bayou Boeuf, August 15th. August 15th, postmarked here. He that is writing for me, where did Base work last summer? He inquired, turning suddenly to his brother. His brother was unable to inform him, but rising left the office, and soon returned with the intelligence that Base worked last summer somewhere on Bayou Boeuf. He is the man, bringing down his hand emphatically on the table, who can tell us all about Solomon Northup? Exclaimed Waddle. Base was immediately searched for, but could not be found. After some inquiry, it was ascertained he was at the landing on Red River, procuring a conveyance. Young Waddle and Northup were not long in traversing the few miles to the latter place. On their arrival, Base was found, just on the point of leaving, to be absent a fortnight or more. After an introduction, Northup begged the privilege of speaking to him privately a moment. They walked together toward the river. When the following conversation ensued, "Mr. Base," said Northup, "allow me to ask you if you were on Bayou Boeuf last August?" "Yes, sir, I was there in August," was the reply. "Did you write a letter for a colored man at that place to some gentleman in Saratoga Springs?" "Excuse me, sir, if I say that is none of your business," answered Base, stopping and looking his interrogator searchingly in the face. "Perhaps I am rather hasty, Mr. Base. I beg your pardon. But I have come from the state of New York to accomplish the purpose the writer of a letter dated the 15th of August, postmarked at Marksville, had in view. Circumstances have led me to think that you are perhaps the man who wrote it. I am in search of Solomon Northup. If you know him, I beg you to inform me frankly where he is, and I assure you the source of any information you may give me shall not be divulged, if you desire it not to be." A long-time Base looked his new acquaintance steadily in the eyes, without opening his lips. He seemed to be doubting in his own mind if there was not an attempt to practice some deception upon him. Finally he said, deliberately, "I have done nothing to be ashamed of. I am the man who wrote the letter. If you have come to rescue Solomon Northup, I am glad to see you. When did you last see him, and where is he?" Northup inquired. "I last saw him Christmas, a week ago today. He is the slave of Edwin Epps, a planter on Bayou Boeuf near Holmesville. He is not known as Solomon Northup. He is called Platt. The secret was out, the mystery was unraveled. Through the thick black cloud, amid whose dark and dismal shadows I had walked 12 years, broke the star that was to light me back to liberty. All mistrust and hesitation were soon thrown aside, and the two men conversed long and freely upon the subject uppermost in their thoughts. Base expressed the interest he had taken in my behalf, his intention of going north in the spring, and declaring that he had resolved to accomplish my emancipation, if it were in his power. He described the commencement and progress of his acquaintance with me, and listened with eager curiosity to the account given him of my family, and the history of my early life. Before separating, he drew a map of the bayou on a strip of paper with a piece of red chalk, showing the locality of Epps Plantation, and the road leading most directly to it. Northup and his young companion returned to Marksville, where it was determined to commence legal proceedings to test the question of my right to freedom. I was made plaintiff, Mr. Northup acting as my guardian, and Edwin Epps defendant. The process to be issued was in the nature of replevin, directed to sheriff of the parish, commanding him to take me into custody and detain me until the decision of the court. By the time the papers were duly drawn up, it was 12 o'clock at night, too late to obtain the necessary signature of the judge, who resided some distance out of town. Further business was therefore suspended until Monday morning. Everything, apparently, was moving along swimmingly until Sunday afternoon, when Waddle called at Northup's room to express his apprehension of difficulties they had not expected to encounter. Base had become alarmed and had placed his affairs in the hands of a person at the landing, communicating to him his intention of leaving the state. This person had betrayed the confidence reposed in him to a certain extent, and a rumor began to float about the town that the stranger at the hotel, who had been observed in the company of Lawyer Waddle, was after one of old Epps' slaves over on the bayou. Epps was known at Marksville, having frequent occasion to visit that place during the session of the courts, and the fear entertained by Mr. Northup's advisor was that intelligence would be conveyed to him in the night, giving him an opportunity of secreting me before the arrival of the sheriff. This apprehension had the effect of expediting matters considerably. The sheriff, who lived in one direction from the village, was requested to hold himself in readiness immediately after midnight, while the judge was informed he would be called upon at the same time. It is but justice to say that the authorities at Marksville cheerfully rendered all the assistance in their power. As soon after midnight as bail could be perfected and the judge's signature obtained, a carriage containing Mr. Northup and the sheriff, driven by the landlord's son, rolled rapidly out of the village of Marksville on the road towards Bayou Burf. It was supposed that Epps would contest the issue involving my right to liberty, and it therefore suggested itself to Mr. Northup that the testimony of the sheriff, describing my first meeting with the former, might perhaps become material on the trial. It was accordingly arranged during the ride that, before I had an opportunity of speaking to Mr. Northup, the sheriff should propound to me certain questions agreed upon, such as the number and names of my children, the name of my wife before marriage, of places I knew at the north, and so forth. If my answers corresponded with the statements given him, the evidence must necessarily be considered conclusive. At length, shortly after Epps had left the field, with the consoling assurance that he would soon return and warm us, as was stated in the conclusion of the preceding chapter, they came in sight of the plantation and discovered us at work, alighting from the carriage and directing the driver to proceed to the great house, with instructions not to mention to anyone the object of their errand until they met again. Northup and the sheriff turned from the highway and came towards us across the cotton field. We observed them, on looking up at the carriage, one several rods in advance of the other. It was a singular and unusual thing to see white men approaching us in that manner, and especially at that early hour in the morning, and Uncle Abram and Patsy made some remarks expressive of their astonishment. Walking up to Bob, the sheriff inquired, "Was the boy they call Platt?" "Thar he is, massa," answered Bob, pointing to me and twitching off his hat. I wondered to myself what business he could possibly have with me, and turning round, gazed at him until he had approached within a step. During my long residence on the bayou, I had become familiar with the face of every planter within many miles. But this man was an utter stranger, certainly. I had never seen him before. "Your name is Platt, is it?" he asked. "Yes, master," I responded, pointing towards Northup, standing a few rods distant. He demanded, "Do you know that man?" I looked in the direction indicated, and as my eyes rested on his countenance, a world of images thronged my brain. A multitude of well-known faces, Ann's and the dear children's of my old dead fathers. All the scenes and associations of childhood and youth, all the friends of other and happier days, appeared and disappeared, flitting and floating like dissolving shadows before the vision of my imagination, until at last the perfect memory of the man recurred to me, and throwing up my hands towards heaven, I exclaimed, in a voice louder than I could utter in a less exciting moment, "Henry B. Northup! Thank God, thank God!" In an instant I comprehended the nature of his business, and felt that the hour of my deliverance was at hand. I started towards him, but the sheriff stepped before me. "Stop a moment," said he. "Have you any other name than Platt?" "Solomon Northup is my name, master," I replied. "Have you a family?" he inquired. "I had a wife and 3 children." "What were your children's names?" "Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo." "And your wife's name before her marriage?" "And Hampton." "Who married you?" "Timothy Eddy of Fort Edward." "Where does that gentleman live?" Again pointing to Northup. who remained standing in the same place where I had first recognized him. "He lives in Sandy Hill, Washington County, New York," was the reply. He was proceeding to ask further questions, but I pushed past him, unable longer to restrain myself. I seized my old acquaintance by both hands. I could not speak. I could not refrain from tears. "So," he said at length, "I'm glad to see you." I essayed to make some answer, but emotion choked all utterance, and I was silent. The slaves, utterly confounded, stood gazing upon the scene, their open mouths and rolling eyes indicating the utmost wonder and astonishment. For 10 years I had dwelt among them in the field and in the cabin, borne the same hardships, partaken the same fare, mingled my griefs with theirs, participated in the same scanty joys. Nevertheless, not until this hour, the last I was to remain among them, had the remotest suspicion of my true name or the slightest knowledge of my real history been entertained by any one of them. Not a word was spoken for several minutes, during which time I clung fast to Northup, looking up into his face, fearful I should awake and find it all a dream. "Throw down that sack," Northup added finally. "Your cotton-picking days are over. Come with us to the man you live with." I obeyed him, and walking between him and the sheriff, we moved towards a great house. It was not until we had proceeded some distance that I had recovered my voice sufficiently to ask if my family were all living. He informed me he had seen Margaret and Elizabeth but a short time previously, that Alonzo was also living, and all were well. My mother, however, I could never see again. As I began to recover in some measure from the sudden and great excitement which so overwhelmed me, I grew faint and weak, insomuch it was with difficulty I could walk. The sheriff took hold of my arm and assisted me, or I think I should have fallen. As we entered the yard, Epps stood by the gate, conversing with the driver. That young man, faithful to his instructions, was entirely unable to give him the least information in answer to his repeated inquiries of what was going on. By the time we reached him, he was almost as much amazed and puzzled as Bob or Uncle Abram. Shaking hands with the sheriff and receiving an introduction to Mr. Northup, he invited them into the house, ordering me, at the same time, to bring in some wood. It was some time before I succeeded in cutting an armful, having somehow unaccountably lost the power of wielding the axe with any manner of precision. When I entered with it at last, the table was strewn with papers, from one of which Northup was reading. I was probably longer than necessity required in placing the sticks upon the fire, being particular as to the exact position of each individual one of them. I heard the words, the said Solomon Northup, and the deponent further says, "and free citizen of New York," repeated frequently, and from these expressions understood that the secret I had so long retained from Master and Mistress Epps was finally developing. I lingered as long as prudence permitted and was about leaving the room when Epps inquired, "Platt, do you know this gentleman?" "Yes, master," I replied. "I have known him as long as I can remember." "Where does he live?" "He lives in New York." "Did you ever live there?" "Yes, master born and bred there." "You was free then?" "Now you de nigger," he exclaimed. "Why did you not tell me that when I bought you?" "Master Epps," I answered in a somewhat different tone than the one in which I had been accustomed to address a Master Epps, "you did not take the trouble to ask me. Besides, I told one of my owners, the man that kidnapped me, that I was free, and was whipped almost to death for it. It seems there has been a letter written for you by somebody." "Now who is it?" he demanded authoritatively. I made no reply. "I say, who wrote that letter?" he demanded again. "Perhaps I wrote it myself," I said. "You haven't been to Marksville Post Office and back before light, I know." He insisted upon my informing him, and I insisted I would not. He made many vehement threats against the man, whoever he might be, and intimated the bloody and savage vengeance he would wreak upon him when he found him out. His whole manner and language exhibited a feeling of anger toward the unknown person who had written for me, and of fretfulness at the idea of losing so much property. Addressing Mr. Northup, he swore if he had only had an hour's notice of his coming, he would have saved him the trouble of taking me back to New York, that he would have run me into the swamp or some other place out of the way, where all the sheriffs on earth couldn't have found me. I walked out into the yard and was entering the kitchen door when something struck me in the back. Aunt Phoebe, emerging from the back door of the great house with a pan of potatoes, had thrown one of them with unnecessary violence, thereby giving me to understand that she wished to speak to me a moment confidentially. Running up to me, she whispered in my ear with great earnestness, "Lor, a mighty Platt, what d'ye think? Dem 2 men come after ye. Heard him tell massa you free got wife and 3 children back, though where you come from. Goin' with em? Fool if you don't wish I could go." And Aunt Phoebe ran on in this manner at a rapid rate. Presently, Mistress Epps made her appearance in the kitchen. She said many things to me, and wondered why I had not told her who I was. She expressed her regret, complimenting me by saying she had rather lose any other servant on the plantation. Had Patsy that day stood in my place, the measure of my mistress' joy would have overflowed. Now there's no one left who could mend a chair or a piece of furniture, no one who was of any use about the house, no one who could play for her on the violin, and Mistress Epps was actually affected to tears. Epps had called to Bob to bring up his saddle horse. The other slaves, also overcoming their fear of the penalty, had left their work and come to the yard. They were standing behind the cabins, out of sight of Epps. They beckoned me to come to them, and with all the eagerness of curiosity, excited to the highest pitch, conversed with and questioned me. If I could repeat the exact words they uttered, with the same emphasis, if I could paint their several attitudes and the expression of their countenances, it would be indeed an interesting picture. In their estimation, I had suddenly arisen to an immeasurable height, had become a being of immense importance. The legal papers having been served, and arrangements made with Epps to meet them the next day at Marksville, Northup and the sheriff entered the carriage to return to the latter place. As I was about mounting to the driver's seat, the sheriff said I ought to bid Mr. and Mrs. Epps goodbye. I ran back to the piazza where they were standing, and taking off my hat said, "Goodbye, Mrs." "Goodbye, Platt," said Mrs. Epps kindly. "Goodbye, master." "You nigger," muttered Epps in a surly, malicious tone of voice. "You needn't feel so cussed tickled you ain't gone yet. I'll see about this business at Marksville tomorrow." I was only a nigger and knew my place, but felt as strongly as if I had been a white man, that it would have been an inward comfort had I dared to have given him a parting kick. On my way back to the carriage, Patsy ran from behind a cabin and threw her arms about my neck. "Oh, Platt," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "You're going to be free. You're going way off yonder where we'll never see ye any more. You've saved me a good many whippings, Platt. I'm glad you're going to be free, but oh, the Lord, what'll become of me?" I disengaged myself from her and entered the carriage. The driver cracked his whip, and away we rolled. I looked back and saw Patsy, with drooping head, half reclining on the ground. Mrs. Epps was on the piazza. Uncle Abram and Bob and Wiley and Aunt Phoebe stood by the gate, gazing after me. I waved my hand, but the carriage turned a bend of the bayou, hiding them from my eyes forever. We stopped a moment at Carey's Sugar House, where a great number of slaves were at work, such an establishment being a curiosity to a northern man. Epps dashed by us on horseback at full speed on the way, as we learned next day to the Pine Woods to see William Ford, who had brought me into the country. Tuesday, the 4th of January, Epps and his counsel, the Honorable H. Taylor Northup Waddell, the judge and sheriff of Avoyelles, and myself, met in a room in the village of Marksville. Mr. Northup stated the facts in regard to me, and presented his commission and the affidavits accompanying it. The sheriff described the scene in the cotton field. I was also interrogated at great length. Finally, Mr. Taylor assured his client that he was satisfied, and that litigation would not only be expensive, but utterly useless. In accordance with his advice, a paper was drawn up and signed by the proper parties. wherein Epps acknowledged he was satisfied of my right to freedom and formally surrendered me to the authorities of New York. It was also stipulated that it be entered of record in the recorder's office of Avoyelles. Mr. Northup and myself immediately hastened to the landing, and taking passage on the first steamer that arrived, were soon floating down Red River, up which, with such desponding thoughts, I had been borne 12 years before. This is it. Chapter 21 is not just a chapter. It is the moment a man stolen from his life, buried in silence, buried beneath cotton and cruelty, is seen again. The moment Solomon Northup's name is spoken aloud by someone who means to bring him home. After 12 years, the past catches up to the present, and the chains begin to shake. Henry B. Northup has come, across miles of road, across boundaries of danger and doubt. He has arrived on Epps's plantation, armed with law, with truth, and with Solomon's name held like a torch. Can you imagine the sound? The sound of your own name, spoken freely. After more than a decade of being called Platt, Solomon hears it, and something inside him breaks, then soars. This chapter tears away the mask that slavery forced upon Solomon. For years he was Platt, property, a body to command. But with one arrival, with one recognition, the lie unravels. The overseers can't stop it. Epps can't stop it, because Solomon isn't asking. He is claiming what was always his identity, his story, his right to walk away. There is no joy in Solomon at first, only disbelief after so many betrayals, after Armsby, after the whip, after the long years of praying into silence. How can he trust that this is real? And yet, when Henry B. Northup presents the documents, when the sheriff confirms the truth, when the wheels of law, slow as they are, finally align, Solomon lets go. He embraces his friend. He says goodbye to Patsy, whose own chains will not be lifted. And he walks away. After 12 years, he walks away. Names have power. And Solomon's name, spoken, signed, upheld by law, destroys the illusion of his enslavement. It reminds every person who watched him labor, every man who beat him, every voice that called him Platt, that he was never theirs. He belonged to himself, to his family, to his memory, and now to history. This moment is monumental, but it did not come without price. Solomon lost 12 years. He lost time with his children. He lost the right to say goodbye to those who died. He carries scars, memories, ghosts, and yet he leaves Epps's plantation with his name intact, his mind unbroken, his story still burning inside him. Not all men escaped slavery, but Solomon did, and he would use that freedom to make the world listen. In chapter 21, a man is reborn. Solomon Northup, once erased, once lost beneath another's name, has returned. The lie has ended. The chains have loosened, and now his feet take the first steps toward home. But the journey is not over, because the world must know what happened here. And Solomon, with ink, memory, and courage, will tell them. Chapter 22. The sun burned high above Louisiana, a merciless eye watching over fields steeped in sweat, sorrow, and silence. The cotton grew tall. The labor never ended. And still, within Solomon Northup, something stirred, a quiet ember of freedom refusing to die. Every stolen moment was another endured, for 12 unrelenting years. But one day, a whisper of change stirred the heavy air. It came in the form of a man named Bass, a white Canadian carpenter working on the plantation. He moved through the brutal southern heat like any other laborer. But when he spoke, something was different. He spoke of justice, of conscience, of the sin of slavery. And he spoke boldly, without fear, even in the presence of slave owners. Solomon watched him, listened carefully. Bass was unlike any white man he had encountered since his kidnapping. Could this man be the key? That night, in the quiet of the slave cabin, Solomon weighed the cost. Trusting the wrong person could mean death. A single word could see him beaten, hanged, buried without a name. But the fire in Bass's voice, the indignation, the conviction, it echoed something Solomon hadn't felt in years: hope. And so, trembling, he made his decision. I will tell him who I am, he thought, and pray he is the man he seems to be. The next day, while Bass worked in the shed, hammering boards into place, Solomon approached him cautiously. His hand shook. His voice was low. I'm not a slave, he said. My name is Solomon Northup. I was born free in New York. I was kidnapped, sold, and I have been held here ever since, 12 long years. Bass froze. His hammer paused in midair. He looked Solomon in the eye and asked softly, You were born free? Solomon nodded. Then he told him everything. The music in Washington, the betrayal, the drugged wine, the iron chains, the plantations, the years, the name Platt forced upon him, the pain, the fear, the hope. Bass didn't speak for a while. He simply listened, eyes steady, heart shaken. That night, under moonlight, Bass sat with pen and paper and wrote the first cry for help Solomon had uttered in over a decade. A letter to Henry B. Northup, a lawyer in New York, and a relative of the Northup family who had once known Solomon as a free man. Bass folded the letter with care and turned to him. I will send this, he said quietly, and if it costs me everything I have, then so be it. And then the waiting began. Days passed, then weeks. The sun scorched down, the work continued, but Solomon's mind was somewhere else, far beyond Louisiana's fields. Every step, every breath, he carried hope like a fragile bird in his chest. Bass never mentioned the letter again, and Solomon dared not ask. But every time their eyes met, he saw something behind Bass's calm face, a promise. And then one morning everything changed. Solomon was summoned to the front of the house. Epps stood waiting, arms crossed, suspicion etched into his face. And beside him, 2 white men, strangers. Solomon's heart thundered. One of the men stepped forward, tall, stern-faced, familiar, and then he spoke a name that shattered the stillness. Solomon Northup. Not a question, a declaration. Tears welled in Solomon's eyes. Yes, he whispered. Yes, I am. The man was Henry B. Northup. Solomon barely remembered moving. The carriage awaited. The papers were signed. Epps raged and protested, but the law, at long last, was on Solomon's side. He stepped into the carriage, not daring to look back. But as the wheels turned and the plantation receded behind him, he turned once to the place that had taken so much, and then he looked forward, toward life, toward his name, toward freedom. The journey north was like waking from a nightmare. Each town that passed, each voice that spoke Solomon instead of Platt, restored a part of him he thought was lost. But fear still lingered. Would it changed? Would his family still be there? Would they even remember him? Henry rode beside him, telling stories of the fight to find him, of Bass's letter, of the people who believed Solomon Northup still lived. And Solomon, silent in the night, wept. Snow blanketed the streets of Saratoga Springs when he stepped off the train. The cold air hit his face, but he hardly felt it. He walked the roads of his past the homes he once knew. Finally, he reached the door. It opened, and there they were, his wife, his children. He froze. They stared, and then no words, just arms. 12 years a slave. Now a man returned. The days that followed were filled with tears, laughter, disbelief. His wife watched him constantly, as if afraid he would vanish again. His children were no longer children. His daughter grown. His son a young man. He had missed everything. Birthdays, books, laughing over breakfast. Ordinary miracles lost to time. And whispered, I never stopped hoping. And Solomon said, I never stopped trying. Freedom had been won, but Solomon knew it wasn't enough. Justice had to follow. He entered the courtroom. He named his kidnappers, James Birch, the dealer who whipped him nearly to death, Merrill and Russell, the men who sold him. He told the truth, every word. The courtroom fell silent. But the law, twisted and cruel, struck back. In the District of Columbia, a black man could not testify against a white man. And so the men who had stolen 12 years of his life walked free. Solomon clenched his fists. Outside in the snow, Henry walked beside him. "We've done all we can here," he said. "But justice," Solomon began. "Justice comes slow in this country," Henry said. "Sometimes it never comes at all." Solomon didn't speak. He simply stared into the cold, bitter wind. That night, alone at his desk, Solomon dipped his quill into ink and stared at the empty page. In one hand, memory, in the other, resolve. He would not let this story die. He wrote, word by word, name by name, place by place. He wrote of Eliza, of Patsy, of Clemens, of Uncle Abram, of all the others who could not speak for themselves. He wrote not for revenge, but for remembrance. He titled it simply, 12 Years a Slave. The book was printed, shared, read aloud in churches, schools, abolition halls. His story became a rallying cry. Frederick Douglass held it high. Harriet Beecher Stowe praised its truth. Solomon's voice became a weapon, his pain a mirror, his truth a flame. He traveled the North, speaking not only of himself, but of all those still in chains. He stood before strangers and said, "I was a free man, then I was not, and now I am again. But there are others still waiting." Years passed. No one knows where Solomon Northup died. No stone marks his resting place. But his voice remains. His words survive. His truth endures. I have been a witness of cruelty, of kindness, of despair, and of hope. 12 years were stolen from me, but I did not vanish. I did not break. I returned not only to my family, but to the truth. Solomon Northup's story echoes through the generations, a reminder that the fight for dignity, for identity, for justice never ends, and that the pen, when wielded by the free, can still break chains.
Freedom. After 12 years of pain, silence, and survival, Solomon Northup goes home, but the scars remain, and so does the story. This concludes 12 Years a Slave, a true testimony of cruelty, courage, and unbreakable spirit. I'm Rob, and you've been listening to Audible Archives. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe. Let's keep voices like Solomon's alive, so history never dares to forget.
Another chapter closes, but the archives remain, waiting for the next seeker of stories. Here, no voice is lost, no tale truly ends. This is Audible Archives. Until we meet again, may your mind wander freely and your heart never forget the stories we share.